Buried under sand, stone, and 3,000 years of silence, Israel hides secrets that defy time, logic, and sometimes sanity. From underwater cities to lost tombs, mysterious monoliths to messages carved in copper, this land is a riddle written in rock. Some of these puzzles whisper, others scream, but none of them are solved. Welcome to 49 most unsolved ancient Israel mysteries that cannot be explained. Strap in. We're about to descend into the dust, where history forgot to leave answers. Before we dive headfirst into the ruins, take a second to hit that subscribe button, because around here, we don't just explore history, we interrogate it. While you're at it, drop a comment below. Where are you watching from, and what time is it right now in your corner of the world? Let's see who's tuning in from the future, or just can't sleep. The exact location of the Ark of the Covenant. The Ark of the Covenant. Golden, glowing, guarded by cherubim, and gone. Not just lost your car keys, gone. Not even buried under bureaucratic red tape, gone. We're talking full-on, biblical-scale vanishing act. One day it was the sacred centerpiece of the temple in Jerusalem. The next? Poof. No smoke, no fire. Just an eternal question mark that's been giving historians and conspiracy theorists equal amounts of sleepless nights. Theories? Oh, we've got theories. Some say it's in Ethiopia, locked in a church guarded by a single monk who is definitely not giving you a tour. Others claim it was buried somewhere under Jerusalem, maybe in the Temple Mount tunnels, which, fun fact, you can't excavate without sparking World War I too. Indiana Jones, for his part, swears it's boxed up in a U.S. government warehouse next to the alien from Roswell. The Ark wasn't just a box, it was the box. Said to hold the original 10 Commandments, a jar of manna, and Aaron's rod. Basically, if the Bible had an Avengers team, this was their headquarters. And yet, despite being the holy grail of sacred relics, Grail, it completely disappears from the biblical record after the Babylonians sacked the first temple in 586 BCE. No goodbyes, no, hey, I'm heading to Alexandria for a bit. Nothing. Now, archaeologists dig, rabbis theorize, and metal detector hobbyists post long TikToks from random desert hills. But after centuries of searching, the Ark remains elusive, possibly hidden in plain sight or sitting under 20 layers of political, religious, and literal stone walls. But while the Ark plays the ultimate hide-and-seek game, just northeast lies something that refuses to stay quiet. A massive, mysterious stone monument that's baffled experts since it was spotted from the sky. Buckle up, we're heading to the Golan Heights. Galgal Rifai, Rujem El Hiri. You know a place is serious when its name literally means Wheel of the Ghosts. Galgal Rephaim, or Rujem El Hiri, looks like what would happen if Stonehenge and a crop circle had a basalt baby. Located in the Golan Heights and built around 3000 BCE, this megalithic monument is composed of over 40,000 basalt rocks arranged in concentric rings. It's enormous, ancient, and just vague enough to invite every single theory from astronomy to alien parking lot. Let's start with the structure. The outermost circle spans over 500 feet in diameter, with progressively smaller circles inside, like a Russian nesting doll designed by a particularly moody Neolithic architect. At the center is a tumulus, or burial cairn, but if you're hoping for a mummy or a cursed priest, tough luck. The tomb appears to have been looted centuries ago, probably by the same guys who couldn't find the Ark. So what was it? A ritual site? An observatory? A giant calendar that helped prehistoric farmers know when to plant chickpeas? Some archaeologists argue it aligns with the summer solstice sunrise. Others think it's just a glorified tomb. And then there's always the fringe squad shouting about Atlanteans, giants, or ancient astronauts. Because of course. What's even weirder? It was mostly invisible until the invention of aerial photography. On the ground, it looks like a confusing pile of rocks, but from the air, it reveals an eerily precise pattern. So either early Bronze Age people had drones, or they were working off a seriously detailed Google Earth printout. And just to spice things up, local legends claim it's haunted, because when you call something Wheel of the Ghosts, you're basically daring people to bring an EMF reader. But if the Wheel of the Ghosts is a riddle built in stone, our next mystery is even more tragic. A grand burial that was meant to be remembered for eternity, but now can't even be found on a map. The missing graves of the Maccabees. You'd think after kicking Seleucid butt and reclaiming the temple, the Maccabees would get the royal burial treatment. Tombs with marble columns, gold inscriptions, maybe a little eternal flame action. Instead, their final resting place is the archaeological equivalent of somewhere over there-ish. Ancient sources, like the Jewish historian Josephus, describe their graves as monumental, literally. He claimed they built pyramids, yes, pyramids, in the hills of Modian, visible from the sea. Flashy stuff. But for all that grandeur, no one's actually been able to locate them. Modern archaeologists have scoured Modian like treasure hunters with a deadline, poking through every hill, cave, and possible hint of hewn rock. They've found tombs. They've found ossuaries. They've found enough pottery to stock a hipster cafe. But the Maccabee tombs? Nada. The problem? Modian is now a city with highways, malls, and a population that gets understandably cranky when you try to bulldoze their backyard in search of 2,000-year-old bones. Add to that centuries of construction, erosion, and people who reused ancient burial sites for their own needs, who hasn't, and the trail goes cold, real cold. Some believe the tombs were intentionally hidden, like a reverse tourist trap. Others argue they were destroyed over time, their stones repurposed for later building projects. Because nothing says sacred memory like turning Judas Maccabeus' sarcophagus into someone's goat shed foundation. Still, the mystery gnaws. These were national heroes, guerrilla warriors who started the Hanukkah story. You light candles every year for these guys. And yet, we can't even find their graves. But maybe that's fitting. After all, the story of Hanukkah is about light persisting in darkness. And sometimes, what's buried the deepest burns the longest. Speaking of deep mysteries, let's take a plunge into a village so ancient and so perfectly preserved that it's entirely underwater. Atlit Yam. Imagine waking up one morning in your beachfront Neolithic village, checking on your goat herd, grinding some barley, and then, boom, your entire civilization gets yeeted into the Mediterranean. That's Atlit Yam, an 8,500-year-old underwater settlement chilling off the coast of Haifa like an ancient Atlantis, minus the glitter and mermaids. Discovered in the 1982 by a marine archaeologist who probably thought he was just looking for sunken boats, Atlit Yam turned out to be a pristine time capsule of prehistoric domestic life, now completely submerged. We're talking stone houses, hearths, wells, and even a graveyard all preserved under the sea like Poseidon's Airbnb. And get this, archaeologists found the skeletons of a woman and child still clutching each other in a kind of forever hug. Adorable. Also horrifying. Also, please cue sad music. But don't cue a tsunami alert just yet, because we still don't fully understand what caused the flooding. Was it rising sea levels from melting glaciers? A localized tsunami? Or was it, the gods punishing them for building a perfect society before they invented TikTok? Even cooler, or creepier, there's a stone circle at the site that some believe may have had ritual significance. Because of course there's a stone circle. It's practically Neolithic zoning law. But unlike Galgal Rephaim, nobody's seen this one from the sky unless they're snorkeling with a waterproof drone. So what did the villagers think when the waters came? Did they flee inland? Did they drown in place? Did they just think, well, that's not ideal, as their sheep floated away. Whatever happened, it left us with an exquisite question mark right off the coast. But while Atlit Yam sinks deeper into myth, let's surface for something equally puzzling, something crafted not in stone or sea, but in mosaic tiles that might just be hiding a secret miracle. And while we're still recovering from the idea that ancient engineers built a tunnel with no GPS and still managed to meet in the middle, take a moment to subscribe if you haven't already. It's the easiest mystery you'll solve today. And hey, drop a comment. Where in the world are you watching from? And what time is it right now? Midnight in Manila? Lunch break in London? We want to know who else is deep in the rabbit hole with us. The precise meaning of the loaves and fishes mosaic in Hippos. You'd think a mosaic showing loaves and fishes would be pretty self-explanatory. Food, Jesus, sharing, Sunday school basics. But no, this one, found in a Byzantine church in Hippos overlooking the Sea of Galilee, has managed to baffle experts with the quiet smugness of a crossword puzzle that's missing half the clues. Here's the image. 3 loaves of bread, 2 fish. Classic miracle setup, right? Not so fast. Because according to the Gospel of Mark, there were 5 loaves and 2 fish. So either the artist ran out of tile budget, or something else is going on here. Scholars have suggested it might be referencing a different feeding miracle. There were a couple. Or that it's meant to symbolize a broader theological concept like spiritual nourishment. Or possibly ancient buffet etiquette. Some even think it may have been a local twist on the Jesus narrative, tailored for the community that worshipped here. You know, the Galilean remix. Or maybe the artist was just a guy named Elias, with very little interest in biblical precision and a strong dislike for symmetry. And then there's the positioning. The mosaic is laid right in front of the altar, literally beneath the priest's feet, so every time someone gave a sermon, they were standing on Jesus' catering miracle. Symbolic? Intentional? Or just the medieval version of putting your best design up front so it looks good on Yelp? Either way, the Hippos mosaic leaves us with questions. Is it a devotional image, a theological Easter egg, or a long-lost meme? We may never know. But one thing's certain. When you're surrounded by fish and mystery, there's a chance something even stranger is lurking in the corner. And that brings us to an artifact so hotly debated it's been called everything from sacred relic to criminal forgery. A humble bone box that may or may not have belonged to the brother of Jesus. The James, son of Joseph, brother of Jesus. Ossuary. Ah, the ossuary. The ancient version of a personalized nameplate, except instead of sitting on your desk, it sat on your bones. And in this case, the inscription reads, James, son of Joseph, brother of Jesus. That's right, that Jesus. Which makes this modest limestone box the holy grail of name-dropping. Discovered in the early 2002, this 2,000-year-old burial box set off a theological fireworks show the moment the inscription was read. If authentic, it's the only physical artifact we have that potentially connects to Jesus of Nazareth. If fake, it's one of the boldest hoaxes in biblical archaeology. Either way, it's caused more drama than a holiday dinner with Judas. Scholars immediately split into 2 camps. One camp said, "This is it! Historical confirmation! Mic drop!" The other camp said, "Hold on, the second half of that inscription looks sketchy, and also the guy who owned it was tried for forgery." That trial? It dragged on for nearly a decade, and ended inconclusively like every season finale of Lost. And just to thicken the soup, James, Joseph, and Jesus were basically the John, Mike, and Steve of first-century Judea. So it could have been anyone's brother Jesus. The inscription might be genuine, partially altered, or entirely fabricated, and the limestone itself certainly didn't leave a forwarding address. Today, the box sits in limbo, not fully proven, not fully debunked, but still displayed in museums with a little asterisk next to its soul. Believers see divine echoes. Skeptics see $signs. Everyone else just wants to know if Jesus' family was into recycling. But whether this box held the brother of the Messiah or just a guy with a famous sibling, it's a powerful reminder of how fragile our links to the past really are. And speaking of fragile, let's crawl under Jerusalem for our next mystery into a quarry that might have once built the most sacred site in the ancient world. Zedekiah's Cave, Solomon's Quarries. If you're the type who thinks caves are just for bats and horror movie plot devices, think again. Zedekiah's Cave, also known as Solomon's Quarries, is a massive underground system right beneath Jerusalem's old city. That's right. While tourists above haggle over postcards and falafel, there's a literal ancient labyrinth yawning beneath their feet, large enough to host an entire rock concert. Which, fun fact, it has. Rediscovered in 1854 by a guy walking his dog. Seriously. This cavernous expanse stretches over 5 city blocks and has been romantically linked to everything from King Solomon's temple construction to Freemason rituals. Because why stop at history when you can add some secret society sparkle? Carved entirely out of Jerusalem limestone, the cave shows chisel marks still visible from ancient quarrying. Archaeologists believe it was used during the Second Temple period and possibly earlier, which means someone was down there hacking away by torchlight long before indoor plumbing was a thing. It's so perfectly hidden and so conveniently located that it's hard to believe more medieval teenagers didn't sneak in for illicit dates and cave graffiti. Oh, and if the name Zedekiah rings a bell, that's because he was the last king of Judah, famously blinded and dragged off by the Babylonians. Legend says he tried to escape through the cave and wept along the way, leaving behind the tears of Zedekiah, a constant trickle of water from the cave wall. Bit dramatic? Absolutely. But this is Jerusalem. Even the plumbing is biblical. So, is this a royal escape tunnel? A holy quarry? A Masonic clubhouse? Possibly all three. Or none. What we do know is that the cave refuses to give up all its secrets. And speaking of things hiding in unexpected places, let's dive under the sea again, but this time, not for a village, for a mysterious underwater mountain of rocks that no one can explain, the Kinneret Mystery Mound. In the waters of the Sea of Galilee, where Jesus supposedly walked and tourists now paddleboard, sits something so weird it makes no geological sense. A massive, conical mound of basalt stones, perfectly stacked, quietly lurking beneath the surface like an aquatic crop circle. This underwater structure was discovered by accident because that's how Israel finds 80% of its archaeology and measures 230 feet in diameter and 30 feet high. That's taller than a 2-story building and bigger than most Bronze Age egos. And the kicker? It's just sitting there, hidden in plain sight under several meters of water. Scientists dated it to around the 3rd millennium BCE, which is way before waterproof construction was trending. So, either this was built on dry land and got swallowed by a shifting shoreline, or some ambitious prehistoric architect went full scuba mode and made history's first submerged art installation. The structure itself looks like an artificial cairn, think, giant grave marker, or maybe ancient maritime GPS. But there's no body, no inscriptions, no offerings, just rocks. Perfectly placed, meticulously arranged, and completely unbothered by your modern confusion. Of course, theories abound. Was it a ceremonial site? A burial for someone important enough to deserve a literal lake monument? Or did ancient Israelites just really hate flat land? No one knows. And until someone sends a full excavation crew in there with a submarine and a lot of snacks, we may never find out. But while the Kinneret Mound is all about shape and silence, our next mystery is much louder, etched into ancient stone with strange symbols that speak of death, divinity, and possibly Neolithic interior design. The decorated dolmen in the Golan Heights. You know a civilization means business when they carve symbols into a 50-ton rock and then use it as a roof for a burial chamber. Enter the decorated dolmen of the Golan Heights, aka the prehistoric penthouse suite for the dead, now baffling archaeologists with its cosmic doodles. Dolmens are megalithic tombs made of massive stone slabs, found all over the ancient world. But Israel's Golan Heights version comes with a twist. One dolmen, in particular, has engravings carved into its ceiling like a Stone Age Sistine chapel, but with fewer popes and more question marks. The carvings, abstract shapes, lines, dot clusters, not exactly your standard, "Here lies Grok, son of Oog" kind of thing. Some say the decorations might represent stars or constellations, turning this tomb into a kind of cosmic gateway. Others think it's ritualistic art for guiding spirits, or maybe just the prehistoric version of doodling on your bedroom ceiling. Adding to the weirdness, these dolmens were built in the intermediate Bronze Age, around 3000 BCE, which we don't usually associate with large-scale construction. In other words, some anonymous mountain folk, armed with stone tools and sheer willpower, moved multi-ton slabs into formation and then added artistic flair, because being dead doesn't mean you can't have style. But perhaps the biggest mystery is who these people even were. They left behind no writing, no records, just a giant rocky shrug with spirals on top. Whatever their story, they went out with a bang and left us guessing for 5,000 years. And now, speaking of uncredited genius, let's take a look at the man or men behind one of the most famous construction projects in Jewish history, and the fact that we still don't know his name. The identity and fate of the architect of Herod's temple. Imagine building the most magnificent temple in the ancient world, columns soaring, gold gleaming, crowds gasping, and then no one remembers your name. That's the sad tale of whoever designed Herod's temple, aka the Second Temple 2.0. Herod the Great got all the credit, of course. He gets called the builder. But the guy who actually made the blueprints? The ancient Frank Lloyd Wright of Judea? Total ghost. Herod's temple was an architectural marvel, bigger than Solomon's, flashier than the Roman Pantheon. It had courtyards, colonnades, a holy of holies, and more marble than a Caesar palace lobby. But somehow, amidst all the chronicling, no ancient scribe bothered to jot down, "Oh, by the way, this masterpiece was brought to you by Mordecai, son of Shlomo, master mason extraordinaire." Nope. Herod hogged the spotlight, and the guy who figured out how to level a mountain, design a perfectly symmetrical layout, and coordinate thousands of workers is now just another casualty of royal branding. Was he a local, a Nabatean, maybe a Roman import with a flair for sacred geometry? Whoever he was, he pulled off a feat of engineering so impressive that even Jesus was like, "Yep, nice building." And yet, when the Romans smashed it all to rubble in 70 CE, his name was lost in the dust and ash. It's almost poetic. Build something divine, and you still might end up a historical footnote. But if the architect of Herod's temple is a mystery of identity, our next enigma is all about stuff holy, glittering, sacred stuff that went missing when everything came crashing down. The ultimate fate of the temple treasures after the Roman destruction in 70 CE, when the Romans stormed Jerusalem and obliterated the Second Temple, they didn't just torch a building, they cleaned out the divine gift shop. The menorah, the altar tools, the golden table for showbread, even the mysterious ark supporting cast gone. And while some of it made a guest appearance in Rome's celebratory parade, immortalized on the Arch of Titus, none of it ever showed up for an encore. So what happened? Some say the loot was taken to Rome, melted down to fund the Colosseum, or lost in the sack of the city centuries later. Others believe it was hidden, maybe spirited away by priests before the final siege, buried in the Judean hills, or stashed in the Vatican basement next to the good wine and secret Dan Brown documents. The temple treasures are a biblical holy grail not just spiritually but archaeologically. They're not just sacred artifacts, they're political powder kegs. Entire expeditions have launched in search of them, with every desert cave and ancient cistern promising the next big revelation. So far, zip, nada. Just more sand and disappointment. And while the Ark of the Covenant gets all the Hollywood buzz, these items were the spiritual heart of Jewish ritual life. Their disappearance isn't just a logistical mystery, it's a rupture in the continuity of faith, a vanishing act with cosmic consequences, because when the sacred disappears, what replaces it? Well, sometimes what replaces it is holes. Lots and lots of holes. Like the kind you find beneath ancient towns in the Judean hills dug by people who were clearly up to something but didn't leave a post-it explaining what. The origin and purpose of the numerous caves and tunnels in the Judean lowlands. If you ever wanted proof that ancient people had trust issues, just take a tour of the Judean lowlands. This region is Swiss cheese with thousands of hand-carved caves and tunnels, seriously. The entire landscape looks like it was hit by an overexcited Minecraft player. But why were they dug, and by whom? And what were they for? Theories abound. Some were hideouts during revolts, Bar Kokhba-style resistance nests complete with secret entrances, water cisterns, and trapdoor vibes. Others may have been used for ritual purposes, or as storage, or for living underground during times when upstairs was full of Romans with swords. The caves often connect in elaborate networks, with rooms, crawl spaces, and enough backtracking to make you wish you'd dropped breadcrumbs. In one area, archaeologists found over 400 bell-shaped caves carved with shocking precision into soft limestone. Another region revealed complex tunnel systems from the Hellenistic and Roman periods, often designed with escape routes in mind, because nothing says Jewish ingenuity like digging your own emergency exit through a mountain. But here's the thing. Many of these tunnels don't have any associated structures above ground, which means someone dug all this and then ghosted. No inscriptions, no obvious trash piles, no helpful graffiti saying, Baruch was here. Just empty underground voids whispering, figure me out. Maybe they were places of refuge. Maybe places of worship. Or maybe they were just ancient introvert bunkers. Whatever the truth, one thing is clear. These tunnels tell a story of people who refused to go quietly and who made the very ground itself part of their resistance. And speaking of resistance, our next mystery takes us to one of the most enigmatic groups in ancient Judea, a fringe community in the desert that gave us scrolls, secrets, and a man known only as the Teacher, the identity of the Man of the Desert, Dead Sea Scrolls enigma. Ah, yes, the mysterious Man of the Desert. Sounds like a biblical Batman, doesn't it? In reality, this cryptic figure is part of the larger riddle surrounding the Dead Sea Scrolls, those ancient texts that exploded into the archaeological scene like a rabbinical mixtape from 2,000 years ago. Found in the Qumran caves by a Bedouin shepherd who was probably just looking for a lost goat, the scrolls include some of the oldest known copies of the Hebrew Bible, along with apocalyptic rants, rulebooks, and poetry that would make your theology professor weep. And at the center of it all, the elusive teacher of righteousness, also known as that desert guy with strong opinions. We don't know who he was, but he clearly had a fan club. His followers wrote extensively about how he was persecuted by the wicked priest, cool name, possibly a rival religious leader or an early prototype of the internet troll. So, who was this guy? A renegade priest? A proto-Essene? A self-declared messiah who just really liked caves? Scholars have proposed everyone from a rebellious temple official to a proto-Christian figure who didn't quite make it into the Gospels. And of course, there's the inevitable fringe crowd that claims he was Jesus in disguise, because every historical blank space is apparently a Jesus-shaped puzzle. The community that wrote the scrolls, likely the Essenes, were desert-dwelling purists who bathed obsessively, avoided the temple establishment, and lived like ancient prepper monks. And yet, they left behind a literary archive that's still causing theological whiplash to this day. But if ancient Qumran was all about words and wisdom, the next mystery isn't interested in subtlety, it's about treasure. Literal, metric ton quantities of hidden gold and silver, mapped out on a scroll made of metal, the copper scroll, and its hidden treasures. So you're sifting through ancient Dead Sea texts, papyrus, parchment, the occasional goat skin, and suddenly, boom, a scroll made of copper. Because nothing screams, this one's different, like a document that needs a blacksmith instead of a scribe. Enter the copper scroll, a list so wild it sounds like the ancient version of a bank heist blueprint. Except the vaults are scattered across the Holy Land, and the loot includes over 60 tons of gold, silver, and sacred goodies. Not suspicious at all. This isn't scripture, it's a treasure map, literally. The scroll describes 64 locations where someone allegedly hid temple treasures, stuff like golden vessels, silver ingots, priestly garments, and enough bling to make a Kardashian blush. Written in a weird mix of Hebrew and Aramaic, its directions are maddeningly vague. In the water cistern under the stairs, at the place of the salt. Oh, you mean that place? Super helpful, thanks. For decades, adventurers, scholars, and enthusiastic tinfoil hat types have tried to crack its code. Some think the treasure is real hidden by temple priests during the Roman siege. Others believe it was a decoy or an inventory list for a mythical stash that never existed. Still, others think the Romans already found it, melted it down, and turned it into commemorative coins with Caesar's face on them. Despite decades of searching, no one has found a single item listed in the scroll. And yet the copper scroll endures an eternal Middle Eastern scavenger hunt with no winners, just sweat, sand, and shattered dreams. But while we're all chasing gold, one mystery takes us back to something far more personal. A tomb that may or may not have held the most famous figure in Christian history. The true location of Jesus' entombment. Jesus' resurrection is the cornerstone of Christianity. But here's a fun theological brain twister. We're not exactly sure where the whole tomb to heaven transition even happened. There are two main contenders: the Church of the Holy Sepulchre and the Garden Tomb. And, like any good real estate dispute, both have strong opinions, lots of tourists, and gift shops selling olive wood crosses. The Church of the Holy Sepulchre is the heavyweight, built in the 4th century by Emperor Constantine's mom, because nothing says power move like your mom funding your religion's headquarters. It covers both the crucifixion site and a tomb claimed to be Jesus's. Problem is, the site is smack in the middle of the old city, so if you were picturing a serene garden setting, you're off by about 12 screaming pilgrims and one very aggressive incense cloud. The Garden Tomb, discovered in the 19th century, has the aesthetic advantage. It's peaceful, it's green, and it looks exactly like your Sunday school flannel graph said it would. But the archaeological evidence? Meh. It's likely older than the time of Jesus and doesn't match burial practices from his era. So what's the verdict? One tomb has tradition, the other has vibes. Neither has conclusive proof. Which means, for now, the burial place of the central figure of Christianity remains a very sacred maybe. And while we're on the subject of divine fire and brimstone, let's head to a place where God allegedly dropped the hammer on an entire city, or 2, or 5, or who's counting? The Sodom and Gomorrah site and its archaeological correlation. Sodom and Gomorrah, the original sin cities. The Las Vegas and Atlantic City of the Bronze Age, but with more brimstone and fewer slot machines. According to the Bible, they were so unspeakably wicked that God went full apocalypse mode, fire from the sky, saltified citizens, the works. But here's the thing, for all that drama, We still don't know exactly where they were, and archaeologists have been trying to pin them down for centuries, like they're chasing the ghost of a really bad Airbnb review. Most biblical scholars agree they were somewhere near the Dead Sea. The Southern Basin? That's a popular guess. The area's chock full of ruined cities, collapsed structures, and layers of ash that practically scream divine smite fest. But nothing definitive. Some think the biblical cities might be Tal el Hammam or Bab Eid Hadra, ancient towns that show signs of sudden destruction, including collapsed walls, burned layers, and skeletons in very uncomfortable positions. Tal el Hammam in particular has gotten a lot of attention. Archaeologists there claim they've found evidence of an intense, high-heat explosion-like event that could have wiped out an entire settlement in an instant. Meteor strike? Cosmic airburst? Flaming vengeance from the heavens? You decide. But this site, which fits chronologically and geographically with the biblical tale, has all the hallmarks of a civilization that went from thriving to extra crispy very quickly. Then there's the question of Lot's wife, the woman who looked back and turned into a pillar of salt. That part has sparked centuries of creative geology. Is there a natural salt formation somewhere that looks vaguely human? Absolutely. Has it been labeled Lot's wife? Oh yes, multiple times. Accuracy? Let's just say people really want to believe in poetic justice made of sodium chloride. Whether it was a moral cautionary tale or a real cataclysmic event, the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah remains one of history's most enduring "did that actually happen?" puzzles. Fire from heaven? Possibly. Sin City wiped off the map? Maybe. Just another Bronze Age city crushed by an earthquake and spun into religious myth? Equally likely. But if we can't quite prove how Sodom burned, we can marvel at another act of ancient engineering that seems almost as miraculous. A tunnel carved through solid rock, perfectly meeting in the middle by hand. In the 8th century BCE, the precise route and methods used to build Hezekiah's tunnel in Jerusalem. Hezekiah's tunnel is the kind of ancient structure that makes modern engineers sweat nervously into their CAD software. Dug around 701 BCE, this water channel runs nearly 1,750 feet through solid limestone, snaking its way from the Gihon Spring to the Pool of Siloam in Jerusalem. Why? Because King Hezekiah knew the Assyrians were coming, and if your enemy lays siege to your city, the last thing you want is to be waterless and thirsty, while they set up lawn chairs outside your walls. But here's the kicker. It was dug from both ends. Two teams started at opposite points without GPS, without flashlights, and probably without a solid HR department, and somehow managed to meet almost exactly in the middle, not off by 200 feet. Not tunneling past each other in a hilarious game of Marco Polo. Nope, they aligned so well that the tunnel still works today. Inside, you'll find ancient chisel marks, curves and kinks, because laser straight wasn't really an option, and even the famous Siloam inscription, a short bit of text carved into the wall by the workers themselves, describing the moment the two teams broke through, which basically makes it the oldest employee morale post in recorded history. So, how did they do it? Echoes, maybe. Geometry, perhaps? Divine guidance? Some think so. But most likely, they used an ancient form of trigonometry, a good sense of direction, and a healthy fear of Assyrian swordplay. What makes this tunnel more than just a historical footnote is that it's still around, still walkable, and still, if you're not claustrophobic, pretty awe-inspiring. You're literally sloshing through water that's been running the same route for 2,700 years in a tunnel carved by hand, by men with nothing but iron tools, guts, and a serious deadline. It's not just engineering, it's survival architecture, and it makes you wonder, if they pulled that off, what else were they crafting back then that we still don't fully understand? Well, how about a bizarre ceramic object covered in tiny figures, sitting like a riddle on a museum shelf, daring you to explain its cultic purpose. The purpose of the cultic stand from Beth Shean. At first glance, the cultic stand from Beth Shean looks like an Iron Age cupcake stand. At second glance, it looks like something out of a Dungeons & Dragons campaign. And by the third glance, your brain is officially fried from trying to figure out what it's actually for. Discovered in the ancient city of Beth Shean, a bustling settlement where Canaanites, Egyptians, Israelites, and Philistines all took turns leaving their cultural graffiti, this ceramic stand dates to the 9th century BCE and stands about 3 feet tall. It's made of 4 stacked tiers, each adorned with a dizzying array of miniature figures. Lions, bulls, women with tambourines, and strange creatures that might be deities, animals, or early attempts at emojis. It's called cultic because, let's be real, when archaeologists find something weird they can't explain, cultic is the academic equivalent of a shrug. Was it used in ritual offerings? A miniature stage for divine puppet shows? A temple centerpiece? All of the above? The best answer so far is probably some kind of religious object meant to represent a cosmic order or divine hierarchy, which sounds fancy but also doesn't explain why there's a tiny drum circle happening on Tier 2. The stand offers a rare glimpse into the complexity of Iron Age belief systems. It mashes together iconography that seems both local and imported, think a theological remix. Some scholars think the female figure might represent Asherah, a controversial mother goddess figure whose worship got quietly edited out of later monotheistic narratives. Others think it's just a generic cult priestess doing a TikTok ritual dance 3,000 years early. What's fascinating is that objects like this challenge our assumptions about biblical-era religion being clean-cut and strictly Yahweh only. In reality, it was messy, hybrid, and full of surprises like a spiritual buffet line where everyone brought their weirdest dish. But just when you think the past can't get any more cryptic, you stumble on something even older and more enigmatic. A simple agricultural calendar that may or may not be homework from 3,000 years ago. The meaning of the Gezer calendar. The Gezer calendar. At first glance, it looks like someone's to-do list scrawled on a limestone tablet. It's just a few lines of Paleo-Hebrew text carved into stone, listing out agricultural tasks month by month: plowing, sowing, reaping, pruning. Very Home Depot meets Book of Judges. But behind its rustic charm lies a mystery that's been poking at scholars like an unsolved Sudoku from the 10th century BCE. Found in the ruins of Gezer, a major Canaanite-turned-Israelite city, this little calendar is often hailed as one of the earliest known examples of written Hebrew. That alone would be enough to get it a spot on the Biblical Artifacts Hall of Fame, but the big question isn't just what it says, it's why it was written in the first place. Was it a student's exercise? Some kind of ancient school homework where little Eitan had to practice writing by copying the farming cycle? Or maybe it was a bureaucratic record, a reminder for royal tax collectors to show up right before the wheat harvest. Others think it might have had religious significance, possibly linked to seasonal festivals and temple offerings. After all, in ancient Israel, agriculture and worship were more intertwined than the roots of a 1,000-year-old olive tree. Then there's the linguistic puzzle. The script itself is so old that it sits in that hazy zone where Hebrew hadn't quite put on its adult grammar pants yet. It has Canaanite flair, Proto-Israelite syntax, and just enough spelling quirks to make language nerds lose sleep. But despite all the ink spilled over this stone, the Gezer calendar remains wonderfully ambiguous. Its simplicity is deceptive: 9 lines of text, but centuries of debate. It's the kind of artifact that reminds us how little we actually know about the people who lived in the biblical heartland and what they thought was important enough to chisel into eternity. And speaking of chiseling the unknown, the next mystery isn't neatly itemized like a farm planner. Instead, it sits atop a remote hill, flaunting a bronze bull and asking, "So, who exactly were you worshipping here?" The bull site in Samaria. Take a wild guess what archaeologists found at an isolated hilltop site in the hills of Samaria. A temple? Number, a palace? Nope. A very confused herd of goats? Possibly. But the real surprise was a small bronze bull figurine, perched proudly as if it were waiting for a tiny cowboy to arrive. Cue the Indiana Jones theme, because this isn't just any old farm animal, it might be a smoking gun for one of ancient Israel's biggest theological debates. Dubbed the bull site, because creative naming isn't always the priority in archaeology, this remote Iron Age location is believed to have been a cultic center. No grand buildings, no golden altars, just some stone installations, altars, and the bull, which instantly raised eyebrows. Because if you've read even a little of the Hebrew Bible, you'll remember that bulls, or more specifically, golden calves, are kind of a big no-no. But here's the twist. Bulls were also used symbolically to represent strength, virility, and even divine power in the ancient Near East. In some interpretations, a bull wasn't the deity itself, but a symbol of the deity's presence, kind of like God's ride, not God himself. So the real debate is, was this bull representing Yahweh in early Israelite worship? Or was it a rival god like Baal making a cameo? Either answer is juicy. If it was Yahweh, it suggests early Israelites may have practiced a version of religion that looked very different from later monotheism, more visual, more symbolic, and definitely more open to animal metaphors. If it was Baal, it points to a deep cultural clash between neighboring belief systems, one that echoed through centuries of religious reform, prophetic rants, and the occasional divine lightning bolt. What we do know is that this little bull figurine was no child's toy. It was cast with care, displayed with reverence, and left behind in a spot that clearly had sacred vibes. Someone somewhere thought it was holy. And that brings us to a slightly more textual, but equally mysterious relic, an inscription that shook the biblical scholarship world by casually name, dropping the House of David carved in stone, no less. The House of David inscription on the Tel Dan Stele. Biblical archaeology has a strange rhythm. Most of the time it's potsherds, walls, and lots of maybes. Then, once in a generation, a stone shouts back. That's what happened with the Tel Dan Stele, an Aramaic inscribed basalt slab from the 9th century BCE that reads, quite clearly, House of David, just 3 words. But those 3 words lit the academic world on fire faster than a Philistine haystack. Before the stele was discovered in the early 1992, skeptics had a field day suggesting David was more myth than man, a literary mashup of tribal heroes rather than a real historical figure. But this find changed that overnight. It wasn't from a Hebrew scribe trying to boost the national mythos. It was written by a foreign king, bragging about his victories. In other words, David wasn't just real. He was famous enough to be name-dropped by his enemies. So what is the stele? It's basically an ancient victory tweet carved in stone by an Aramean king, possibly Hazael of Damascus, boasting about battles against Israel and Judah. The full text is fragmentary, of course, because no ancient monument is allowed to be completely legible, but the phrase House of David is right there. No ambiguity, no asterisks. But the debates didn't stop. Some scholars questioned whether it really meant the biblical David, or if it could refer to another David altogether. Others parsed every chipped letter to argue over translations like medieval rabbis dissecting a scroll under candlelight. But most experts agree it's legit, and it connects to the same David who took down Goliath with a sling and later ruled a kingdom that would inspire dynasties, messianic hopes, and a lot of stained glass windows. The Tel Dan Stele isn't flashy. It doesn't sparkle. It's not gold-plated. But it drops a mic from the 9th century BCE, saying, yeah, David was a thing. And now that we've confirmed the king, how about the giant he fought? Because there's a potsherd out there with a name eerily close to Goliath, and it's about to make things even weirder. The Goliath fragment, and its connection to the biblical narrative. Somewhere in the ruins of the ancient Philistine city of Gath, home of that famously tall warrior with a javelin collection, and a bad attitude archaeologists unearthed a potsherd. That's right, not a sword, not a giant skull, not even a helmet, a broken piece of pottery. But what made this fragment scream louder than a stadium full of underdogs? It had two names etched into it, Alwat and Walt, which, in Philistine language, are just one missed vowel away from Goliath. Cue the collective archaeological gasp. This potsherd dates to the 10th or 9th century BCE, roughly the time the biblical Goliath would have been stomping around intimidating shepherds and losing badly to slingshots. So, naturally, the find set off a flurry of speculation. Did it belong to the Goliath? Was it his cereal bowl? His fan club registration card? A party invitation for someone else with a similarly ominous name? Well, probably not. Most scholars agree it wasn't the Goliath. But what makes it fascinating is that names like Goliath were actually in use among the Philistines at the time. This means that even if the David versus Goliath story was later epicified for dramatic effect, it's rooted in a real cultural context. The name wasn't made up. It was part of the local name pool, possibly even a pretty standard one, which takes the Goliath narrative out of the pure myth zone and places it gently into possibly historical legend with some real-world flavor. The Philistines, after all, weren't just Israel's biblical punching bags. They had their own writing system, their own naming conventions, and apparently a flair for intimidating baby names. So while the Goliath potsherd doesn't come with a blood-smeared slingstone or a divine voiceover, it whispers something profound. The enemy wasn't just a caricature. He was part of a complex world, full of stories, language, and ceramic kitchenware. And if one little fragment can do that, imagine what a whole skeleton might say. Speaking of mysterious remains, let's move from broken pottery to something far more intimate, a perfectly preserved female skeleton found in a cave near Ein Gedi. Her story? Still untold. The identity of the Lady of Ein Gedi. Buried deep within the cliffs overlooking the Dead Sea, near the desert oasis of Ein Gedi, lies a cave with a secret. Not gold, not scrolls, a woman. A well-preserved female skeleton, curled in eternal slumber, untouched for centuries until her accidental rediscovery by modern archaeologists. She became known simply as the Lady of Ein Gedi, and we know just about as much about her as we do about who actually built Stonehenge, which is to say, not much. She was discovered in a dry, stable cave environment, which helped preserve her remains almost eerily well. Her bones suggest she was young, healthy, and possibly of some importance. She wasn't just tossed in there. The burial appeared intentional and careful. She was laid out with what appeared to be ritual respect, though the exact religious context is, of course, as murky as the Dead Sea itself. No inscription, no identifying jewelry, no artifacts that scream, "Hi, I was a priestess," or "Local noblewoman, please return if found." Just silence. The kind of silence that makes archaeologists frown and historians cry into their coffee. Was she fleeing something? Was she a victim of conflict, disease, or was she buried there in peace, perhaps as part of a now-lost burial tradition specific to Ein Gedi? The surrounding caves have yielded a mix of everything: scrolls, coins, Roman relics, rebel hideouts, so it's not exactly the kind of place you'd choose for a quiet picnic. Some have speculated she might have belonged to one of the fringe Jewish communities, Essenes, Zealots, or even early Christian groups that sought refuge in the wilderness. Others think she may have predated all of that, her presence a lingering echo from a Bronze Age society we haven't fully mapped yet. In any case, she remains a poignant mystery, a real person, once alive in a place known more for ancient texts than human touch. She didn't leave us a scroll, a grave marker, or even a dramatic backstory, just bones, perfectly preserved and perfectly silent. But while her identity fades into the desert winds, Another discovery from the far side of the same landscape stirred controversy in all directions. A set of inscriptions that dropped a theological bombshell in the form of a divine couplet, Yahweh and his Asherah. The Contil Azrude inscriptions and their controversial interpretations. Contil Azrude is a desert outpost in the middle of nowhere, literally. A lonely hilltop site in the Sinai Peninsula, miles from anything resembling a Starbucks, where ancient travelers once stopped to rest, worship, and apparently write theological graffiti that would confuse scholars for decades. Discovered in the 1972nd, the inscriptions at this remote location are like an Iron Age Reddit thread, messy, opinionated, and full of spicy takes. Amid drawings of animals, musicians, and geometric patterns, one line stood out and triggered an archaeological mic drop: Yahweh of Samaria and his Asherah. Wait, his Asherah? Asherah was a well-known Canaanite goddess, often associated with fertility, trees, and the kind of divine femininity that ancient monotheists usually tried very hard to forget. So, when Yahweh is paired with her, it raises all kinds of holy eyebrows. Was this an actual religious pairing? A symbolic representation? Or just some scribe in the desert trying to be edgy? Some scholars argue that this inscription reflects an older, pre-monotheistic form of Israelite religion, one where Yahweh may have had a consort, or at least where local worship was a little more flexible than the final draft of Deuteronomy would prefer. Others suggest his Asherah might refer not to a goddess, but to a cultic object, like a pole or sacred tree that was associated with Yahweh worship. And then there are the drawings, doodles, really of bulls, musicians, and what appears to be two humanoid figures with hands raised. Deities? Worshippers? Early cartoon characters? No one knows. It's the Iron Age equivalent of finding a napkin sketch and trying to reconstruct a lost religion from it. Contil Azrude throws a wrench into the tidy narrative of ancient Israelite monotheism. It reminds us that the transition from polytheistic traditions to strict monotheism wasn't a clean break. It was a messy divorce, full of mixed messages, lingering icons, and the occasional theological love triangle. And speaking of messiness and conflict, let's shift gears to a site that represents raw imperial force, the kind of engineering nightmare that makes mountains bleed. The Roman siege ramp at Masada. The full extent and purpose of the Roman siege ramp at Masada. Masada isn't just a fortress, it's a monument to defiance, desperation, and one of the most insane military engineering projects in ancient history. Perched high above the Judean desert on a mesa that practically screams, "Try and reach me, losers," Masada was the final stronghold of the Jewish revolt against Rome in the 1st century CE. But while the Zealots held out with sheer cliffs as their walls, the Romans stared up and said, "Cool story," and started building a mountain. Enter the Roman siege ramp, a 375-foot-tall earthen monstrosity, built stone by stone, shovel by shovel, day by scorching day. Thousands of Roman soldiers moved dirt, rocks, and rage until they had literally sculpted a path up to the fortress gate. It's not just impressive, it's borderline psychotic. No dynamite, no bulldozers, just pure spite and manpower. A living testament to what happens when engineers don't have a weekend. And here's the part that still baffles experts: how fast they did it. Some estimates suggest the ramp was completed in just a few months. That's lightning speed considering the conditions: boiling sun, dry air, occasional flying arrows, and the general logistical nightmare of building a siege structure on a cliff. The ramp itself is still visible today, a scar carved into the desert, sloping up like the world's angriest ski slope. It allowed the Romans to wheel up a battering ram, breach the walls, and according to Josephus, walk into silence. Because by the time they entered, the defenders had committed mass suicide. Tragic, controversial, and shrouded in questions, the event turned Masada into a symbol of resistance and the siege ramp into a literal road to legend. But what else was this ramp? Some theorize it was also a statement, a psychological weapon, as much as a physical one. You thought you were safe? We'll move a mountain to prove otherwise. And that kind of drama is uniquely Roman. Still, the ramp stands. You can walk it. You can climb it. And as you do, you might wonder what kind of desperate calculus was being done on both sides, up top and down below. And while Masada is an ode to dramatic endings, Israel is dotted with cities that didn't go out in a blaze of glory. Some just vanished, quietly, abruptly. Which brings us to a question that archaeologists still whisper about. Why did so many ancient towns suddenly empty out? The reasons for the abandonment of various ancient settlements throughout Israel. Israel is a land of ruins. But not just the kind left behind after sieges and sackings. Some of these ancient towns weren't destroyed. They weren't conquered. They were just left. Doors locked, ovens cold, tools lying where they were dropped, a ghost town's echo without the horror movie soundtrack. From Negev outposts to northern hill towns, you'll find settlements that were once thriving, complete with walls, homes, storage rooms, granaries, and then suddenly abandoned, like the ancient version of a group chat gone dead. Why? That's the mystery. Climate change is the reigning champion of explanations. Droughts may have pushed populations out, especially in marginal areas. No rain means no crops, and no crops means no reason to stick around unless you're a lizard. In other cases, shifting trade routes may have pulled people toward newer hubs and left the old cities to rot. After all, no one wants to live in a Walmart after they've built a Costco next door. Then there's disease. Some archaeologists speculate that plagues might have swept through, especially in tightly packed cities with, let's say, less than stellar plumbing. The remains of sudden burials and hasty graves suggest communities facing something fast, terrifying, and invisible. Warfare, of course, is always a suspect. Even if a city wasn't destroyed in battle, the threat of violence or the encroachment of an enemy could lead to strategic relocation. Why wait to be burned out when you can preemptively pack your donkey and head for the hills? But the most unsettling theory? We just don't know. Some towns vanished with no clear reason, leaving only a riddle of stone foundations and ceramic shards behind. People left, but didn't leave an exit note. No sign of disaster, no farewell graffiti, just absence. It reminds us that ancient life wasn't always grand conquests or divine wrath. Sometimes it was slow decline, quiet desperation, or just the need for a better water source. Or maybe they got bored and wanted a change of scenery. Even 3,000 years ago, people were moving for real estate and weather. And speaking of early real estate decisions with political weight, let's take a look at one of the most hotly debated sites in biblical archaeology, a fortified city with 2 gates and possibly the first concrete proof of King David's rule, the Kerbet Kayafa site, and its implications for the United Monarchy. Kerbet Kayafa is the kind of site that gives archaeologists both goosebumps and migraines. Perched on a hill overlooking the Elah Valley, right where David supposedly fought Goliath, this 10th century BCE settlement has been pitched as Exhibit A in the case for the historical King David, which of course instantly makes it controversial. The site is small, tightly planned, and heavily fortified, with thick walls and well-constructed gates. What really got people buzzing? The fact that it had 2 gates. That might not sound like a big deal, but in ancient city design, 2 gates is kind of unusual. It led some scholars to identify the site as biblical Sharim, which literally means 2 gates. Coincidence? Maybe. Compelling? Absolutely. Even juicier is the carbon dating, which places Kerbet Kayafa right in the time window when David is said to have ruled. Combine that with the urban planning, the absence of pig bones, suggesting a Judahite, non-Philistine culture, and the discovery of early Hebrew inscriptions, and suddenly you've got a possible royal city on your hands. But not everyone's on board. Some argue it could have been a Canaanite or Philistine site. Others claim it's too small to be a capital, more of a military outpost. And then there are those who think the whole united monarchy was more of a loose tribal confederation with a good PR team than a real kingdom. What's undeniable is that Kerbet Kayafa punched way above its weight. It was sophisticated. It was defensible. It had written texts and central planning markers of an organized society. Whether that society was David's budding kingdom or just one of several power centers is still up for grabs. But this hilltop ruin continues to provoke big questions. Was there really a central authority in Judah that early? Was David more than just a bandit king with a harp? And can a pair of city gates really rewrite biblical history? If gates and walls tell one story, then temples tell another, and our next stop is a Philistine holy site, where things got weird, ritualistic, and possibly fishy in more ways than one. The Philistine temple at Tel Casile and its rituals. Tel Casile is one of those archaeological sites that starts out looking modest, a few mounds, a bit of rubble, and then sucker punches you with unexpected complexity. Nestled on the northern bank of the Yarkon River, this site was once a thriving Philistine city, and among its most intriguing features is a temple complex that dates back to the 12th century BCE. That's right. While the Israelites were still ironing out their tribal politics, the Philistines were already building places to appease gods who probably looked like hybrid sea creatures with a flair for drama. The temple at Tel Casile is a masterpiece of subtle mystery. It's a rectangular structure with three main sections: a vestibule, a central hall, and a rear sanctuary, kind of like the divine equivalent of a studio apartment. It also contains benches along the walls, offering stands, and a stone pedestal in the middle. What was offered there? Who was worshipped? And what went down during these rituals? We've got guesses, not answers. The Philistines, with their Aegean roots, brought over a weird and wonderful blend of traditions. Their chief deity may have been Dagon, a god who gets an unflattering cameo in the Bible when his statue faceplants in front of the ark. But the archaeological evidence at Tel Casile isn't shouting any single god's name. Instead, it's whispering symbols and half-erased gestures, ceramic altars, libation vessels, fragments of figurines. Some theorize that rituals here included music, dance, food offerings, and perhaps even ecstatic states of worship. The presence of incense burners suggests a sensory element, smoke curling into the rafters while worshippers chanted or wailed or just tried not to pass out from the fumes. There's no hard evidence of human sacrifice, so don't expect any Indiana Jones scenes. But the rituals were likely intense, deeply communal, and thoroughly un-Israelite. That's part of what makes this temple so fascinating. It offers a glimpse into a rival religious system, one that competed with, influenced, and was eventually overwhelmed by Israelite culture. But for a moment in time, Tel Casile was a spiritual center with its own rules, rhythms, and gods who probably appreciated a good olive oil offering. And while this temple gives us a structured space for sacred rituals, the next mystery is more architectural chaos. A synagogue that stacks two time periods on top of each other like a theological layer cake. The Capernaum Synagogue and its various layers. In the sleepy fishing village of Capernaum, where Peter had a house, Jesus performed miracles, and first-century sandals left holy footprints, stands a synagogue that's a beautiful architectural mess. The current visible structure is a majestic white limestone building, complete with ornate columns and carved decorations. But here's the catch. That building dates to the 4th or 5th century CE. Dig a little deeper, literally, and you'll find the remains of a much earlier synagogue, possibly 1st century, possibly the one where Jesus actually taught. Cue the dramatic zoom in. This dual-layered synagogue setup has fueled decades of debate. Was the later synagogue built exactly on top of the earlier one, as a kind of memorial upgrade? Or was it more of a close enough situation, with the original location now lost under centuries of construction and pilgrimage foot traffic? The basalt foundations beneath the white limestone seem to suggest a previous structure. But were they part of a religious building? A civic hall? A first-century fish market that got spiritually rebranded? No one can say for certain, which is frustrating when you're trying to pin down one of the few places Jesus may have actually preached. Then there's the architectural styling. The later synagogue is massive and Romanesque, clearly influenced by Greco-Roman tastes. Columns, Corinthian capitals, decorative friezes with Jewish symbols. It's a blend of local faith and imperial aesthetics, like a yarmulke with a laurel wreath. But why go so big in a sleepy fishing village? Some suggest it was a pilgrimage hotspot by then, others that a wealthy patron wanted to leave a holy footprint with flair. What's remarkable is how this one site encapsulates centuries of Jewish life. Modest beginnings, destruction, rebuilding, reinterpretation. It's a palimpsest of devotion, layer after layer of belief, community, and the sheer stubbornness of sacred architecture. And speaking of stubborn architecture, let's now pivot to something far less refined. A bunch of stone circles in the desert, their purpose as cryptic as a camel's grocery list. The purpose of the circular structures found in the Negev desert. Scattered across the bone-dry expanse of the Negev desert are hundreds of enigmatic stone circles, lines, and spirals silent, sun-baked, and stubbornly undeciphered. At first glance, they look like the leftovers of a failed rock garden project or a Neolithic attempt at minimalist sculpture. But as archaeologists started mapping them out, it became clear these weren't random. They had purpose, probably. Hopefully. They vary in size, but many are large enough to be seen from the air, and some are connected by low stone lines that stretch for hundreds of meters. Were they burial sites? Territorial markers? Astronomical observatories? All of the above? Or maybe just prehistoric crop circles with better PR? One theory says they were part of early agricultural practices, stone fences or animal pens, designed to manage flocks in a landscape where everything, including the sheep, is perpetually thirsty. Others suggest ritual or symbolic use. Maybe these circles were part of ceremonies, earthbound zodiacs or spiritual maps carved into the sand. And yes, as always, someone has to bring up aliens. Because if there's a vaguely circular pattern on the ground and we don't know what it means, clearly extraterrestrials are to blame. The trouble is, these structures lack the usual archaeological breadcrumbs. No inscriptions, no grave goods, no clear association with settlements. They just sit there, in the middle of nowhere, mocking our ignorance. You can measure them, map them, admire their symmetry, but they won't tell you their story. What they do tell us is that someone, thousands of years ago, cared enough to move rocks into precise patterns in a place where surviving the week was already a miracle. That means they mattered, even if we don't know how or why. And from forgotten circles in the desert, we move to a newly discovered monastic site where ancient monks decided to decorate their walls with Bible verses and one very specific shout-out to Moses. The Byzantine monastery, with the Deuteronomy inscription near Kiryat Gat. In the quiet hills near Kiryat Gat, where wheat fields ripple and goats live their best pastoral lives, archaeologists stumbled upon a Byzantine-era monastery that had apparently been hiding in plain sight for over 500 years. You'd think a walled religious compound with mosaic floors and wine presses would be hard to miss, but that's the charm of Israel. Turn over any rock, and it might have a chapel underneath. The real gem of the site? A Greek inscription quoting the book of Deuteronomy. Specifically, the classic, "Blessed shall you be in the city, and blessed shall you be in the field." A solid choice for an inscription, really catchy, inspiring, and agriculturally appropriate. It's like the biblical version of Live, Laugh, Love, but with fewer Etsy fonts. This discovery raises deliciously awkward questions. Why Deuteronomy? Why here? And who were these monks cultivating blessings while bottling wine and baking bread? The inscriptions suggest they were literate, theologically savvy, and proud of their rural outpost. It wasn't just a place of solitude, it was a statement. This field, this land, this monastery was under divine protection and corporate sponsorship from heaven. Structurally, the site has all the Byzantine monastic hits: a church with a nave and apse, side rooms for prayer and maybe naps, communal dining spaces, and, of course, a wine press, because apparently you can be ascetic and still appreciate a good vintage. And yet, like many such sites, it was abandoned. When, how, or why, no one's quite sure. But the quote from Deuteronomy still sits there, sun-bleached and elegant, blessing both the stones and the soil. So far from the center of Jerusalem, so far from the battles and politics that dominate the period's history, this monastery was quietly living out a theological ideal, a spiritual fortress in a vineyard, a handwritten Bible verse made of stone. But while this monastic complex was serenely quoting scripture, another site in the north was playing host to a very different mystery, a pair of Egyptian sphinx claws that somehow ended up buried in a Canaanite city. Yes, claws, and no, we don't know how they got there. The sphinx claws found in Tel Hazor. Tel Hazor was once the New York City of the Canaanite world, a huge, powerful city-state with trade networks, massive fortifications, and a flair for architecture that says, we have influence and we're not afraid to flaunt it. So when archaeologists started excavating its grand palace, they expected impressive stuff: ivories, inscriptions, maybe some gold. What they didn't expect was two enormous sphinx paws. Just the paws. No face, no lion body, just stone claws, carved in unmistakable Egyptian style. Cue confused head-scratching. These granite fragments were clearly part of a monumental statue, probably a full sphinx that had been imported or gifted from Egypt. One of the paws even had an inscription referencing Pharaoh Mycerinus Menkaure, the guy responsible for one of the pyramids at Giza. So now the mystery has layers. Was the Sphinx a diplomatic gift? A war trophy? Or the ancient version of architectural recycling? What's even weirder is that there's no full statue. Just the claws. Were the rest of the pieces looted? Destroyed? Still buried under Hazor somewhere, waiting to pounce on future archaeologists? Theories abound. One possibility is that the Sphinx was intentionally brought in to legitimize Hazor's rulers. Imagine being a Canaanite king and flexing your foreign connections by planting a giant statue from the land of pyramids right at your palace entrance. It screams, "We do business with the big boys." But then there's the destruction layer. Hazor was famously razed in the 13th century BCE, and many believe it was torched by invading Israelites or a rebellious internal uprising. The paws were found in the debris, suggesting that whatever the Sphinx once stood for, power, prestige, divine protection, it didn't work. The claws now sit in a museum, their mystery intact. They remind us how interconnected the ancient world really was, and how sometimes a city in the hills of northern Israel could find itself in possession of Egypt's royal leftovers. And speaking of unexpected leftovers, let's zoom into a burial chamber from the Bronze Age where archaeologists found a perfume ingredient that had no business being there because vanilla, my friends, is supposed to come from Mesoamerica, not ancient Israel. The Tel Megiddo vanilla enigma. Buried in a royal tomb at Tel Megiddo, yes, that Megiddo, as in Armageddon, archaeologists uncovered something so mind-bending, it makes Indiana Jones look like a casual weekend hobbyist. Alongside the expected artifacts, jewelry, gold, ceremonial daggers, they found traces of vanilla. That's right, vanilla, the stuff in your cookies and your overpriced latte. In a 3,500-year-old burial chamber in ancient Israel. To understand how bonkers this is, You need to know that vanilla comes from orchids native to Mesoamerica. That's thousands of miles, one massive ocean, and several centuries away from where this tomb is located. So how did it get there? Spoiler, we don't know. That's why it's a mystery. Some scholars suggest the vanilla compound might have come from a different plant with similar chemical properties. Maybe an ancient version of vanilla dupe. Others cling to the tantalizing, if implausible, notion of prehistoric global trade networks. Like someone from Bronze Age, Canaan hitched a ride on a very long boat and came back with a flavor profile. But even if it wasn't imported from the Americas, the fact remains. These people were flavoring their elite tomb offerings with exotic, aromatic substances. Why? To please the dead? To honor the divine? Or maybe just to keep up with the Joneses of the Bronze Age mortuary world? And here's the kicker. Megiddo wasn't just any city. It was a political and military powerhouse strategically located, heavily fortified, and wealthy enough to build tombs with ceiling-to-floor flair. That someone there had access to rare and possibly foreign spices suggests an elite class that was cosmopolitan, connected, and very into luxury death rituals. The vanilla enigma remains unresolved, but it challenges everything we thought we knew about ancient trade, burial practices, and dessert flavors. It also opens the door to new questions about communication, commerce, and just how far people were willing to go to impress the gods and their ancestors. And if this perfume puzzle has you questioning ancient literacy levels, wait until you hear about the next find. A pile of dusty pottery that might be the Iron Age version of an inbox, complete with notes from commanders, soldiers, and guys trying to get out of night duty. The Arad Ostraca, and their implications for literacy in ancient Judah. If you think ancient bureaucrats were boring, think again. The Arad Ostraca are here to prove that even in the 7th century BCE, people were drowning in paperwork, except theirs was written on broken pottery shards. Discovered at the ancient fortress of Arad in the Negev desert, these inscribed fragments are like the Iron Age's answer to sticky notes, emails, and passive-aggressive memos. And they're full of juicy tidbits, military orders, supply lists, complaints about logistics, and shout-outs to Yahweh for good measure. But the real bombshell isn't what the Ostraca say, it's who was writing them. Analysis suggests that multiple individuals, from different ranks in the military and administration, were literate enough to scribble messages. Not just a royal scribe or temple elite, but regular officers and quartermasters. That kind of widespread literacy? It's not what we expected from ancient Judah. The traditional view has been that writing was a specialized skill, monopolized by a narrow caste of elite scribes. But the Arad Ostraca blow that notion wide open. The language is Hebrew, the script consistent with the period, and the content surprisingly casual. It's the kind of everyday documentation that suggests literacy wasn't just for court poets and priests. It had trickled down to the frontier outposts and dusty command posts of Judah. That means people in the kingdom of Judah weren't just reciting oral traditions around the campfire, they were also writing down inventory, issuing orders, and possibly sneaking in a bit of personal commentary. Which, in turn, suggests that the infrastructure for preserving texts like the Bible was more robust and widespread than previously assumed. It's a glimpse into a world where ink and clay served the same function as Slack channels and Google Docs. A messy, human, administrative miracle. And while no one's quoting psalms on these shards, the very act of writing reveals a culture that was organized, literate, and increasingly textual. And speaking of expressive culture, let's now switch from words to stone art, a fearsome lion found in the ruins of Hazor that raises big questions about identity, symbolism, and whether ancient sculptors were part-time mythologists. The Hazor lion and its cultural influences. In the sprawling ruins of Hazor, a city so massive it makes other Bronze Age towns look like quaint villages, archaeologists unearthed a statue that stopped them in their tracks. A basalt lion, regal, stoic, and totally confusing. Because this wasn't just any lion. It had a peculiar blend of styles, suggesting a cultural mashup that screams artistic identity crisis. The Hazor lion combines elements from Mesopotamian, Egyptian, and local Canaanite artistic traditions. It's fierce but stylized, powerful but oddly abstract. It doesn't quite look like something out of Egypt, yet it doesn't fully match Mesopotamian patterns either. Instead, it lives in the in-between, a sculptural diplomat balancing three civilizations. So what was it doing in Hazor? Was it part of a temple complex? A gate guardian? A symbolic protector of the city? Theories abound, but one thing is clear. This wasn't just decorative fluff. In ancient iconography, lions meant business. They symbolized royalty, divine authority, and cosmic power. You didn't place a lion statue in your courtyard unless you were making a statement. Probably something like, "This is our house, and we bite." The hybrid nature of the sculpture also points to Hazor's position as a cultural crossroads. It was a trade hub, a military powerhouse, and a diplomatic center where Egyptian, Mesopotamian, and local elites all mingled, bickered, and tried to one-up each other's building projects. The lion, then, becomes a metaphor in stone, a product of artistic globalization before globalization was even a word. What's frustrating is that we still don't know exactly who commissioned it or what it was meant to guard. The context of its discovery was damaged, and the passage of time has eroded whatever meaning it once had. All we have now is the beast itself, silent, brooding, and taunting us with its ambiguity. But that's ancient art for you, half icon, half riddle. And if lions guarding city gates aren't mysterious enough, how about a synagogue floor covered in astrology symbols? Yep, time to talk about the zodiac inside a house of worship. The Beit Alpha Synagogue Mosaic and its zodiac depictions. Step into the Beit Alpha Synagogue, and your expectations will be turned upside down literally, because staring up from the mosaic-covered floor is a giant zodiac wheel. Yes, that zodiac. With Aries, Taurus, Scorpio, and the whole cosmic crew laid out in full technicolor glory right there in the middle of an ancient Jewish house of worship. Cue the awkward silence from the iconoclast gallery. Discovered in the 1922nd, this 6th century CE synagogue near the northern Jordan Valley features a jaw-dropping mosaic in its central nave. The artwork is divided into 3 panels: a scene of the binding of Isaac, a depiction of a Torah shrine with ritual objects, and smack in the middle a zodiac calendar complete with Helios, the Greek sun god, riding a chariot. Let's pause. That's a Greco-Roman sun deity in a Jewish synagogue, surrounded by constellations, flanked by Hebrew month names. If this sounds like the setup to a historical joke, it kind of is. But instead of confusion, what we find is a surprising blend of sacred tradition and cultural fusion. Was it heresy? A bold act of syncretism? Or just excellent interior design? Scholars still argue. Some believe the zodiac symbolized divine order, the celestial mechanics of God's universe mapped out for the faithful like an astral clock. Others argue it reflected popular culture creeping into religious life. After all, astrology was trendy, even among scholars. Who doesn't want to know if Mercury is in retrograde before fasting? And then there's Helios. He wasn't just a foreign god, he was also a convenient stand-in for cosmic power. Some think his chariot was less about literal worship and more about visual metaphor. The sun, as God's handiwork, driving the seasons, ruling time, making your crops grow. In other words, theological shorthand. The Beit Alpha mosaic forces us to confront how messy religious identity was in late antiquity. These Jews weren't practicing in a vacuum. They lived in a world buzzing with Greco-Roman imagery, philosophical debates, and artistic trends. And instead of rejecting it all, they stitched it into their spiritual narrative, stars, chariots, and all. And now that we've seen the zodiac crash a synagogue, let's pivot to something a little grittier. an inscription that gives us a rare glimpse into Philistine politics and the kings who ruled their bustling cities from behind iron walls. The Tel Mikn Echron inscription and the identity of its rulers. The Philistines were often cast as the boogeymen of biblical stories, uncircumcised troublemakers with an affinity for giants and bad manners. But when archaeologists unearthed the Tel Mikn Echron inscription, suddenly these villainous side characters got real names, real dates, and a seat at the geopolitical table. Found embedded in the ruins of a monumental temple at Tel Mikn, identified as ancient Ekron, this limestone slab, dating to the 7th century BCE, included a royal who's now internet famous in archaeology circles, Achish, son of Padi, ruler of Ekron. And just like that, the Philistines weren't just a faceless cultural enemy anymore, they were kings, with lineages, gods, and architectural ambitions. The inscription is short and sweet, essentially dedicating the temple to the goddess Pijech, possibly a local deity, and naming several rulers in the dynastic line of Ekron. It's the ancient Near Eastern equivalent of a ribbon-cutting ceremony plaque, only with a bit more gravitas and slightly less red tape. What's remarkable is that these kings were previously known only from Assyrian sources, so for once, the archaeological and historical records high-fived each other. But beyond the big reveal of a Philistine power structure, the inscription throws open the doors to a new vision of Philistine society. They weren't just raiders or cultural interlopers. They had complex city-states, temples, dynasties, and diplomatic ties stretching from Mesopotamia to Egypt. Ekron alone was an industrial powerhouse, especially in olive oil production, kind of the Napa Valley of the Iron Age. And the temple? Monumental architecture, baby. It speaks volumes about Ekron's religious life, prestige, and connection to the larger political matrix of the region. These weren't just godless pagans with a seafood allergy. Seriously, they didn't eat pork or fish like everyone else. They were a thriving, organized, polytheistic people with a calendar, a priesthood, and probably a pretty decent party scene. The Tel Mikn Echron inscription peels back centuries of stereotype and lets us see the Philistines not as the enemies of Israel, but as contemporaries, rivals, neighbors, and occasional frenemies on the same patch of ancient earth. And if a single inscription can rewrite the story of an entire people, what happens when we find an entire temple that looks suspiciously like one from the Bible except it's in Syria? Let's find out at Ein Dara, the Ein Dara temple, and its possible influence on the Solomonic temple. If imitation is the sincerest form of flattery, then the Ein Dara temple in northern Syria has a suspiciously familiar architectural ego. Discovered in the 20th century, this Iron Age temple predates Solomon's temple by a couple of centuries, but the floor plan? Strikingly similar. 3-part layout: entry porch, central hall, inner sanctuary. Check. Monumental dimensions. Check. Stone lions and sphinxes flanking the entrance like a Hollywood red carpet? Double check. So naturally, scholars started scratching their heads. Did Solomon's architects borrow blueprints from Ein Dara? Was there a shared Near Eastern temple template floating around, like a sacred IKEA manual? Or did the two sites emerge from the same cultural religious stew that flavored everything from Ugarit to Babylon? The similarities go deep. Ein Dara even has gigantic footprints carved into the floor, one set outside, one set inside, possibly symbolizing the deity entering the temple. It's either symbolic divine presence or the earliest known attempt at fantasy cosplay. But it begs the question, were Israelite builders influenced by this style? Or were both temples just expressions of a wider regional aesthetic? Biblical descriptions of Solomon's temple are grand and detailed cedar beams, gold overlay, cherubim wings that touch wall to wall, but the actual archaeological evidence of Solomon's temple? Missing. Poof. Gone. So Ein Dara steps in as a kind of ghost double, a shadowy blueprint of what the Jerusalem temple might have looked like. The implications are massive. If Solomon's temple borrowed from Ein Gedi, it means Israelite religion was embedded in a broader Near Eastern context, not an isolated act of divine architectural inspiration, but one deeply connected to neighboring cultures. Monotheism may have come later, but early temple worship? It had neighbors. Of course, not everyone agrees. Some scholars say the similarities are overstated. Others argue that shared layouts were as common then as strip malls are now. But the debate itself highlights something crucial. Solomon's temple wasn't built in a vacuum. It was part of a vibrant, competitive, interconnected world of divine real estate. And while Ein Gedi challenges our mental blueprint of sacred space, our next mystery takes us beneath the streets of Jerusalem to a watery maze that might have been ancient plumbing or ritual infrastructure, or something else entirely. The Jerusalem water channel under the Old City. Beneath the bustling markets and sun-bleached stones of Jerusalem's Old City lies a secret river of stone. The Jerusalem water channel, or as some call it, the ancient drainage tunnel, is more than just a glorified gutter. It's a subterranean riddle. Discovered running under the city of David, this massive channel winds its way through bedrock, carrying runoff water, mystery, and maybe even some revolutionary footsteps. At first glance, it's an impressive feat of urban engineering, dug during the Second Temple period, possibly as early as the Hasmonean or Herodian era. It stretches hundreds of meters under the city. It's tall enough in places for a grown adult to walk through, assuming you don't mind the occasional bat or questionable drip from the ceiling, and it would have been essential for managing waste and floodwaters in a city that didn't have modern plumbing, but did have tens of thousands of sandal-wearing pilgrims. But here's where it gets weird. Some scholars think this wasn't just a drainage system, it might have doubled as a secret passage, a backdoor route for rebels during the Great Jewish Revolt. According to Josephus, Jewish fighters used underground channels to escape the Roman siege. And when archaeologists found scorched debris, broken pottery, and even weapons in the tunnel, they began to wonder, was this part sewer, part escape room? The water channel also runs beneath major biblical-era structures, suggesting it was carefully planned around sacred geography. Its very existence speaks to a city that was both holy and practical, where ritual purity and urban maintenance went hand in hand. Walking through it today is like entering a time machine. The stones still echo, the walls still sweat, with millennia of secrets. You're not just seeing where ancient water flowed, you're seeing where lives passed, where soldiers hid, where prayers rose quietly through the floorboards of history. It's a reminder that Jerusalem's story isn't just told above ground in golden domes and ancient streets, it's whispered below, in the darkness, where history still trickles by. And speaking of strange terrain, let's now head to the Negev again, where a field full of boulders sits like a geological tantrum and no one can figure out why. The bulbous field in Nahal Zohar. If you ever find yourself wandering through Nahal Zohar in southern Israel, dodging cacti and trying not to melt under the Negev sun, you might stumble across something that doesn't make sense. Not that a lot of ancient ruins make sense, but this is next-level weird. An enormous field littered with massive, smooth, rounded boulders, what archaeologists and baffled hikers alike call the bulbous field. Imagine a giant spilled a bag of stone marbles and then left without explanation. That's Nahal Zohar's bulbous zone. These boulders are large, too large to be moved, easily rounded, in a way that suggests they didn't just fall off a cliff or tumble naturally into place. There's no volcano nearby, no riverbed to have smoothed them out, and certainly no ancient civilization known for playing extreme bowling. The question is, how did they get there? Natural formation? Maybe, but they don't align with typical geological patterns for the region. Human? Made? Possibly, but for what purpose? There's no temple, no settlement, no walls, no tools, just boulders. Dozens, maybe hundreds of them, spread across an open expanse like ancient punctuation marks on a desert sentence no one can read. Some researchers have suggested they might be ancient agricultural markers, but there's no terracing or irrigation system to back that up. Others think they might be burial markers for a nomadic culture that didn't leave much else behind. And of course, there are always those fringe theories, astronomical markers, ceremonial paths, alien stopovers. The boulders aren't telling, and the desert isn't giving up its secrets easily. The one thing we can say with certainty: someone or something went to a lot of trouble to place those rocks there. And when ancient people haul multi-ton stones into a specific formation for no obvious reason, it's usually either religion or insanity, possibly both. So the bulbous field sits, sun-baked and silent, a monument to either forgotten rituals or geological mood swings. Either way, it's a visual riddle carved in stone. And while these boulders may refuse to tell us who moved them, our next stop brings us to 5 cities whose very names ring with biblical significance, but whose full borders and buried secrets remain maddeningly elusive. The exact location of the ancient Philistine Pentapolis cities, Gath, Ashkelon, Ashdod, Gaza, Ekron. These 5 cities made up the infamous Philistine Pentapolis, a league of urban heavyweights that dominated the southwestern Levant and annoyed the ancient Israelites for generations. You'd think with names that show up in nearly every major Old Testament skirmish, we'd know exactly where each one was, and for the most part, we kind of do. But when it comes to pinning down their precise ancient boundaries, full city layouts, and archaeological hearts, things start to get wobbly. Take Gath, for example, Goliath's supposed hometown. It's generally associated with Tel Asaphi, and archaeologists have done amazing work there. They've found fortifications, olive presses, destruction layers. But was that all of Gath? Or just the fortified center? How far did its suburbs stretch? Did the city's population fluctuate dramatically during different periods? Was there a Philistine IKEA in the outskirts we haven't dug up yet? Ashkelon is another major site impressively excavated with clear remains of Philistine culture, imported Mycenaean-style pottery, and even a massive city gate. But how did it interact with neighboring cities? What were its territorial claims? And what made it tick beyond what the Bible tells us? The same questions apply to Ashdod, Gaza, and Ekron. While their locations are broadly agreed upon, the borders of these cities, both physical and cultural, remain fuzzy. Did they control the surrounding hinterlands? Did they share common political structures? Or were they more like competitive siblings in a rocky family? And don't even start with the constant rebuilds. These cities didn't just vanish after the Philistines. They got layered over by Persians, Greeks, Romans, Crusaders, Ottomans, and 1,000 years of modern construction. It's like trying to dig up a lost iPhone that's been paved over by a freeway and a shopping mall. What makes the mystery compelling is how much these cities shaped the geopolitical and cultural landscape of the region. They weren't just background noise, they were power players. But the full scale of their urban sprawl, religious centers, economic engines, and political influence is still being pieced together. And now, from the grand scale of city-states, let's zoom in to something deeply personal and haunting. The carefully plastered skulls of Jericho, one of the oldest and creepiest expressions of early human memory. The Jericho skull and its meaning. When most people think of Jericho, they picture collapsing walls and trumpet-blasting Israelites. But long before Joshua's marching band showed up, Neolithic Jericho had already claimed a place in archaeological legend. Why? Because it gave us one of the most bizarre and haunting artifacts ever dug up: plastered human skulls. Yep, just the skulls, with faces re-sculpted out of plaster and shells stuck in for eyes. Welcome to 8000 BCE, where ancestor veneration got very literal. These skulls weren't buried randomly. They were carefully prepared and placed in homes or communal areas, suggesting that the dead stayed very much part of the living community. It's one thing to have a family portrait on the mantle. It's another to have Uncle Uzziel's face staring at you with creepy shell eyes while you eat breakfast. The process was intense. After death, the skull was removed, the flesh stripped, and the cranium modeled with lime plaster to recreate facial features. Artists even added paint and pigment to enhance realism. Then the skull was placed, sometimes grouped with others, like a mini Neolithic reunion. But why go to all this trouble? Theories vary. Some believe it was a form of ancestor worship honoring the dead, keeping their memory alive, maybe even asking them for favors or protection. Others suggest these skulls had a political or social function, proof of lineage, status, or leadership. Look, I've got the founder's head on my shelf. Beat that. There's also the theory that it was part of an early cult of the dead, where human remains were infused with spiritual or ritual power. Whatever the case, these plastered skulls are among the earliest known examples of portraiture and maybe even of religious expression. And they're not limited to Jericho. Similar skulls have been found across the Levant, pointing to a shared tradition among early Neolithic societies. But Jericho's examples remain the most iconic, the most detailed, and the most unsettling. They whisper of a world where death didn't mean departure, where faces were preserved in clay and memory had weight, literally. And from ancestor heads to megalithic monuments, our next stop is a place where upright stones once stood in solemn ranks. A ritual site? A sacred space? Or just another mysterious high place that refuses to explain itself? Welcome to Gezer. The Gezer High Place, and its purpose. You've heard of Gezer, one of the cities gifted by Pharaoh to Solomon, a place of strategic significance and heavy biblical footnotes. But tucked away in this ancient city is a cluster of stones that have puzzled archaeologists and theologians for generations. The Gezer High Place. Think of it as a prehistoric Stonehenge, but without the Druids or the helpful solstice alignment. Just a series of standing stones, 10 in total, stuck in the ground like ancient stone teeth. Located near the city's gate complex, this so-called high place consists of monoliths, some taller than an NBA forward, others shorter, set in a line with little to no accompanying inscriptions or symbols. Just big rocks, standing, awkwardly, but deliberately. The term high place is itself a bit of a catch-all. In biblical parlance, it's often associated with illicit worship, those shady hilltop altars where Israelites were constantly warned not to go offering sacrifices to Baal or Asherah. But here at Gezer, we're not entirely sure what was going on. There's no altar, no smoking gun, no convenient graffiti that says, "To Marduk, with love." Some scholars believe the stones represented gods or ancestral spirits. Others think they may have symbolized tribal leaders or clans, each stone marking a different group in some kind of political or religious pact. And then there's the theory that it was a fertility cult site, because of course there is. Ancient fertility worship tends to get invoked whenever phallic-shaped stones are involved, and, well, let's just say these stones are suggestively vertical. Adding to the confusion is the presence of a basin nearby, carved into the rock, possibly used for libations or ritual cleansing. So we've got upright stones, a mysterious basin, and no clear ritual context. Welcome to biblical era ambiguity. But here's the kicker. Whatever this place was, it was important enough to be preserved through multiple layers of settlement, which means it had staying power, ritual, symbolic, or political. Or maybe all three. And just when you think you've nailed down who built these enigmatic structures, the next site throws everything into question, because we're about to enter a vast desert trap built for herding antelope or confusing the daylights out of archaeologists. Welcome to the world of the desert kites. The identity of the people who constructed the desert kites in the Negev and other arid regions. Across the arid landscapes of the Negev, Jordan, and even into Syria, lie sprawling stone formations known as desert kites. From the ground, they're hard to spot, just low stone walls snaking across the dusty plains. But from the air, suddenly they come into focus, Massive, kite-shaped enclosures stretching across the earth like ancient blueprints, long arms funneling into a corral or pit. And the weirdest part? Nobody really knows who built them. They're called kites because of their aerial resemblance to, you guessed it, a kite. But their real purpose appears to have been more practical and also more deadly. The most accepted theory is that they were game traps designed to funnel herds of gazelle or other desert animals into a killing zone where hunters could easily finish the job. Ancient drive-thrus for mass animal slaughter. But who were these desert engineers? The structures date back as far as 9,000 years ago, placing them deep in the Neolithic period. Which means they predate most cities, most writing, and most of what we'd call civilization. Yet whoever built them had serious planning skills. These aren't random piles of rocks. They're coordinated, massive, and require both labor and knowledge of animal behavior. Some of the kites stretch for kilometers. Imagine the amount of coordination it would take to build one without modern tools, and probably without shoes. The sheer scale implies a communal effort and possibly even seasonal gatherings of people working together to construct, maintain, and use these mega traps. But the identity of the builders? Still a mystery. No inscriptions, no tools, no associated dwellings that can definitively be linked to the kites. Just the rock patterns, whispering across millennia. Some speculate they were built by early pastoralists who also practiced limited agriculture. Others think they were specialized hunting groups who left little behind except their stone signatures. And naturally, there are the inevitable fringe theories, aliens, ancient mega-civilizations, the usual suspects. What's clear is that these structures show a level of intelligence and environmental adaptation that often gets overlooked in the story of early human settlement. They weren't just wandering the desert, they were shaping it. And speaking of sacred, ancient places shrouded in mystery, let's now enter a space so controversial, it remains largely off-limits to archaeologists, the Cave of the Patriarchs, where history, holiness, and geopolitics all collide. The Cave of the Patriarchs, Machpelah, and its true archaeological contents. Welcome to one of the holiest, most contested, and least excavated sites in the entire Middle East, the Cave of the Patriarchs, also known as Machpelah. Located in Hebron and venerated by Jews, Muslims, and Christians alike, this site is traditionally believed to house the tombs of Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Sarah, Rebecca, and Leah. Basically, it's the VIP section of biblical ancestry. Above the cave stands a massive Herodian structure, majestic stone walls, Roman-inspired architecture, and later additions from Islamic and Crusader periods. It's a historical sandwich of sacred real estate, and no one wants to be left out of the lunch. Unfortunately, this same reverence is what keeps the site archaeologically sealed, tighter than the Ark of the Covenant in a government warehouse. Because of the religious and political sensitivity, full-scale archaeological excavation has never happened here. It's the archaeological equivalent of Schrödinger's tomb. You might have patriarchal remains, ancient relics, or a really underwhelming empty cave, but until someone's allowed to dig, it's all speculative. We know the superstructure above is from the time of Herod the Great, and it's one of the only Herodian buildings still standing in its original form. That, in itself, is incredible. But what lies beneath is where the true mystery kicks in. Are there burial chambers carved into the bedrock? Are there actual remains? Did later builders move or disturb whatever was originally placed there? One narrow shaft, discovered in the 1962nd, gave a brief glimpse into the underground chambers, enough to confirm that, yes, there is something down there. Reports from that brief descent describe rock-cut rooms, ancient features, and silence. Lots of silence. Since then, the site has been locked down, studied only from afar, with modern archaeologists forced to speculate based on surface architecture and old texts. The Cave of the Patriarchs sits at the intersection of faith, myth, and mystery. It's a sacred place wrapped in political tension, where every stone carries millennia of theological weight. And yet, it remains archaeologically mute. And while the identities of those buried in Machpelah may be forever cloaked in stone, the next mystery brings us to a nearby valley and a monument that screams for attention. An elaborate tomb claimed to belong to one of the Bible's most tragic sons, Absalom. The grave of Absalom, Yad Avshalom, in Jerusalem's Kidron Valley. It's hard to miss the so-called grave of Absalom, towering in Jerusalem's Kidron Valley like an ancient hat worn by a particularly stylish rock. This monument is part burial chamber, part stone fashion statement. Traditionally associated with Absalom, the rebellious son of King David who went full drama queen and tried to overthrow his father, the tomb stands tall, ornate, and utterly confusing. Because here's the twist. It almost certainly wasn't built by or for Absalom. First, let's talk style. The structure blends several architectural motifs, Greek, Egyptian, and Nabatean. Flourishes all clash together in a glorious limestone Frankenstein. It has a square, lower base, carved straight out of the cliff, topped with a domed upper section, crowned by a conical finial that wouldn't look out of place on a Baroque cake. The blend of styles suggests a 1st century CE origin, about 1,000 years too late for poor Absalom. Still, the name stuck. Why? Because of a long-standing Jewish tradition that ties the site to the biblical rebel. According to lore, Absalom built this tomb for himself during his lifetime, possibly as a divine insurance policy in case all that hair-tossing and political scheming didn't pan out. Which, spoiler alert, it didn't. He ended up hanging from a tree by his luxurious locks and was promptly skewered by Joab. Not exactly the ending he was going for. Despite the timing mismatch, the site became a place where generations of parents brought disobedient children to throw stones at Absalom's tomb as if to say, "This is what happens when you ignore bedtime." The monument, whether his or not, became a symbol of betrayal, hubris, and very bad father-son communication. Inside, the tomb includes a burial chamber empty now, of course along with niches that may have once held ossuaries or memorial inscriptions. The facade is carved with columns and decorative flourishes that hint at wealth, prestige, and a desire to be remembered. Whether Absalom was ever near it or not, someone important definitely wanted their death to be an architectural event. So while the identity of the entombed remains uncertain, the message is clear. Don't mess with Dad if your hair is flammable and you live in a political powder keg. And from this towering monument of misattributed memory, we now descend into the desert once more to investigate a newly uncovered pyramid structure near the Dead Sea because apparently the ancients weren't done building mysterious triangles in unlikely places. The mysterious pyramid near the Dead Sea, Nahal Zohar. Just when you thought the desert couldn't get weirder, along comes a pyramid. Not in Egypt, not in Mesoamerica, but tucked away near Nahal Zohar, not far from the Dead Sea, a lonely 2,200-year-old structure that looks like someone tried to build a mini Giza, got distracted, and never came back. This pyramid, more like a stepped platform with angular aspirations, was recently uncovered and has archaeologists buzzing with questions. Built from local stone, it's modest in size but unmistakably deliberate in its shape. It doesn't dominate the landscape like its Egyptian cousins, but it definitely wasn't just a random pile of rocks, and it wasn't just a grave, either. The structure appears to have had multiple phases of use. The original function remains uncertain. Some speculate it might have been a fortress lookout post, a tax collection checkpoint, or even a signaling station. Later, it seems to have been repurposed as a tomb, with human remains and burial offerings found inside, because in ancient times, everything was eventually turned into a tomb. It's like the real estate motto was, location, location, eternal rest. The odd placement of the pyramid perched on an isolated slope suggests it was intended to be seen from afar. That's where the signaling theory comes in. Maybe it was part of a line-of-sight communication network that once stretched across the Judean desert, blinking messages in torchlight from mountaintop to mountaintop like a Bronze Age Wi-Fi. But then there's the symbolic angle. Pyramidal shapes often signified divine or royal power. Could it have been a monument to authority in a borderland region? A visual marker saying, "This land is under the control of someone important"? If so, who? Nabateans? Hasmoneans? Some forgotten desert warlord with a flair for geometry? The structure's mystery deepens when you consider its proximity to the Dead Sea, a region known for seismic activity, salty extremes, and more than a few biblical fireworks. It's a place where permanence is a paradox and where every stone has multiple pasts. So while this desert pyramid might not solve the riddle of the Sphinx, it adds another enigmatic triangle to the map of ancient Israel, one with no clear owner and no clear message, just sharp angles and endless questions. But if ancient monuments whisper about power, one burial site in a nearby cave shouts something far older echoes of a time when humans first started burying their dead with meaning. Get ready for Tinchemet Cave, where bones, tools, and possible Neanderthals wait in silent testimony. The Tinchemet Cave, 100,000-year-old burial site. Tinchemet Cave is not your average burial site. It's not even your average archaeological site. This Paleolithic cave near Rosh Hayin contains what may be the oldest known intentional burial in Israel, dating back roughly 100,000 years. And it has everything you'd want in a prehistoric mystery: ancient bones, possible grave goods, and the looming question of who or what was buried there. Let's start with the star of the show, a carefully arranged skeleton, complete with bent limbs, a stone placed on the chest, and associated flint tools nearby. This wasn't some accidental death followed by a landslide. This was intentional, thoughtful, possibly even spiritual. And here's where it gets spicy. The identity of the buried hominin. Was it a Homo sapiens, a Neanderthal, or some interbred hybrid child of both? The jury's still out. The morphology of the bones carries traits from both sides of the prehistoric family tree, which means we may be looking at a literal evolutionary crossover episode. But regardless of species, the burial tells us something extraordinary. This was a society, however primitive, that had concepts of death, memory, and possibly even afterlife. They weren't just surviving. They were reflecting. And when you're living in a world filled with predators, plagues, and very sharp rocks, taking time to bury your dead is a powerful act of humanity. Even more intriguing are the objects found with the skeleton: flint tools, animal bones, and signs of red ochre, an iron-rich pigment often associated with early symbolic behavior. That splash of color might mean ritual, or respect, or a simple Paleolithic version of rest in style. Tinchemet Cave challenges our assumptions about early humans in the Levant. It shows that, long before temples, kings, or scrolls, people here were thinking deeply about death, about identity, about what lies beyond the final breath. And while the bones have been studied in labs and 3D scanned into virtual immortality, the cave still holds its secrets. Because for every mystery we solve, another dozen sit quietly in the shadows like the final mystery in our lineup. A network of caves used during a desperate rebellion, where every chamber whispers of resistance, survival, and sacrifice. The exact historical and archaeological context of the Bar Kokhba revolt caves, deep within the Judean hills, hidden beneath sun-baked cliffs and thorny silence, lies a maze of caves that once echoed with the breath of rebels. These were not just hiding spots. These were survival bunkers, field hospitals, family shelters, and final refuges. Welcome to the subterranean world of the Bar Kokhba revolt, the last stand of Jewish resistance against Rome, and one of the most haunting chapters in ancient Israeli history. The revolt, which raged from 132 to 136 CE, was led by Simon Bar Kokhba, a charismatic messianic figure who briefly carved out an independent Jewish state. For 3 defiant years, his forces waged guerrilla warfare against the Roman Empire, arguably the most ruthless, best-equipped military machine the ancient world had to offer. And, when the tide turned, and Rome came crashing down with all its legions, the rebels went underground, literally. The caves they used, scattered throughout the Judean desert and beyond, were no mere crevices. These were modified with narrow entrances, internal walls, concealed passageways, and tiny tunnels designed to be defensible. Some were natural caves enhanced by human hands, others were carved entirely from scratch. Their purpose was clear: outlast the storm. Archaeological discoveries from these sites paint a chilling, intimate picture. Inside the Cave of Letters, for example, researchers found personal belongings: sandals, combs, coins, documents, and even letters written in Bar Kokhba's own name, ordering supplies and issuing commands. These weren't just soldiers, they were families. Whole communities went underground, clutching their identity, faith, and hope. But hope ran out. In many caves, skeletons were found, some huddled together, others alone, preserved in the dry desert air. These were not casualties of battle. They were people who died waiting. Starvation, dehydration, disease, take your pick. The caves became tombs. And yet, even in death, they left behind testimony. Letters signed by warriors, scribbles by children, coins minted in rebellion, and weapons forged in makeshift smithies. It was resistance written in dust and blood. The Roman response was brutal. Judea was renamed. Jerusalem became a pagan city. Jewish life in the region was shattered. But the caves remain a jagged scar carved into the landscape and into history. These caves remind us that mystery isn't always about the unknown. Sometimes, it's about what we do know, but still can't quite comprehend: the courage, the desperation. The silence of stones that once heard the cries of a people refusing to disappear. And with that final echo from the depths of history, our journey through the 49 most unsolved ancient Israeli mysteries comes to a close. But let's be real. With ruins like these, the past is never really silent. It just waits for someone else to start digging.